people say science is on the side of the argument against antibiotics, you'll be hard-pressed to find much more high-tech science than what you just saw. Clearly showing there's a lot going on in the world of the microbe, and key question really is how much of it is your fault? That's what the Congress wants to know. That's what the consumers want to know. Your fault being the producer or the veterinarian who prescribes it. And so I'm going to try to address that a little bit and then maybe give you some suggestions for what I think you should do about it. Well, it's interesting, you know, there's this perspective in the world that if anything is commercial, it's wrong. You know, if you make money doing it, then it must be wrong. But, you know, you guys took it to a new level at this meeting. This is the first time I ever saw a restroom sponsored by a particular group. And, you know, what worried me is, what if they couldn't find a sponsor? Would they just close them all? So, thank goodness for our sponsors, huh? The big one makes it go forward, Randy? Yep, okay. What I think we're going to try to talk about today is what does the risk-based science say about the use of antibiotics on the farm, and then give you some ideas what I think the future might look like in this area. Just a reminder, we're talking about antibiotic resistance, okay? We're not talking about antibiotic residues. We assume that you're following directions, that you're withdrawing products, and I tell people antibiotic residues, i.e. molecules in the meat, is illegal. Okay? We're talking about these bacteria that have the ability to fight against the antibiotic. And like this cartoon says, he says, honey, is it me, or do our kids seem much more resistant than we ever were? And that's the bottom line of what people are talking about. They are seeing more resistance problems, particularly in the hospital. And they're looking for solutions. I mean, it's a significant concern. And they realize, the medical community realizes that the doctors have a lot to do with it as far as prescribing too much. And I'm happy to see that in most doctors' offices now, you'll see a pamphlet that says why you don't need antibiotics for your cold. And that's a good thing, because the doctors are a tendency to, you know, you got to give the patient something, give them an antibiotic and send them home. So that's good. They realize their role in it, but then a lot of people think that the farmers also has a lot to do with it. And my question is really, why is there a debate? And I think there's a number of different issues that go to play in here as to why there's a debate, because the science tells me that the risk is minimal from what we're doing on the farm. But then there's the question of acceptable risk. You notice I didn't say the risk was zero. There is a minimal risk of human health harm, a few days of diarrhea because of what we're doing on the farm. Another question really is people struggle with, well, who benefits? It used to be Grandpa who benefited from, you know, treating the occasional sick animal. Now, consumer doesn't know Grandpa. Grandpa's in Florida, Grandpa was an accountant, Grandpa had nothing to do with farming. Unlike you folks, where everyone's still a few steps away from the farm, 99% of the world's population have no idea how hard it is to raise a pork chop. And so they think you guys are just lining your pockets, pumping them full of antibiotics, and they're not happy with that concept. Another reason there's a debate at the public policy level is just the precautionary principle. Particularly in Europe, they think if there's a risk, a chance of a risk, we're not going to do it. Okay, that's called the precautionary principle, and thank goodness in the U.S. our regulatory people don't go down that road. I think a key issue is the difference between risk-based versus science-based. Everybody says we need science-based decision-making. Most of you here drove here in an automobile. Are there any mechanical automotive engineers in the room? No. You used an incredibly scientific piece of equipment to transport yourself here. But you don't understand the science. Okay? Point being that using science is not the same thing as making a scientific decision. Okay? The real question is not the science. I mean, the science, somebody showed me an article this morning, they found resistant bacteria in flies from pig farms. Duh. Doesn't surprise us, right? That's good science. I mean, they can show you all the genetic pictures like Randy did of what those bacteria were like. That's good science. But that's not saying there's a risk. You'd have to eat a lot of flies to get enough bacteria to cause infection. In fact, the bacteria that they found in that fly is not even one that causes human illness. Like Randy said, it's just an enterococcus. So you've got to move to the next level, which is what's actually the risk that's being posed. Another key thing, quite honestly, is the non-scientific political agenda. People just want to make it hard for you to raise pigs. That's all there is to it. And here's an example. This is a map showing people who support the PAMTA bill that we just mentioned, banning many uses of antibiotics. And it's interesting, most of these people are from the left coast and the right coast. Okay? What do they know about farming? Why are they doing this? They think there's a risk. Or maybe there's some other reason. I'm not going to get into that. Just key point to take home is we have a concern. I have a concern. Randy has a concern. You all have a concern about the possibility that antibiotic use is hurting people. You don't want to do that. You don't want to hurt your customers. But a concern is not a risk. Okay? This quote here is from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They figured it out in 1995. You know, people are really concerned about nuclear accidents and about nuclear energy. However, we have to use some risk assessments in order to really address that, in order to reduce the unnecessary conservatism. In other words, people's anxiety is going to prevent us from ever building another nuclear plant. Okay? The answer is probabilistic risk assessment. Answer the question, what's the risk versus what's the concern? And that's what I'm arguing for this issue. We need to do this. You too can do a risk assessment. So this is risk assessment for dummies. I'm driving across the parking lot, and my wife says, put on your seatbelt or you'll perish. What's wrong with that rationale? Chance of an accident in a parking lot is what? High or low? High. Most accidents happen in the parking lot. Okay, so the probability is high. But what? Not going very fast, so the probability of an injury is pretty low. And so risk, you have to understand, is both things going together. Probability of an injury given that you have an accident. It's a conditional probability. And the key thing is that people really forget all the time is you've got to have both. Accident without injury cost me $500 deductible. Okay? The consequence is different. So we can calculate the risk of an accident as the probability first that you'll have a wreck, and that's a function of things like traffic on the road, road type, weather, speed. So that's the first step. Driver skill and alertness, bring all those together, that tells you your probability, the first one. And then you have to have the second one, what's the chance you're going to get hurt? Well, there's speed at impact, there's whether you had a seatbelt on or not, and this is where we use science. How do we answer that question, what's the probability of injury with a seatbelt? We do studies. You can go find lots of studies from crash dummies, from real accidents, and we can put a probability on that based on the best available science. And that's what risk assessment does. It brings together all these different pieces in order to estimate these probabilities. And then the type of accident, we know that if you have a glancing versus a head-on, there's a much different chance of people getting hit. Key thing of risk assessment is just that, a simple set of conditional probabilities. I say that to help people understand it's not really that hard. Okay, I have to remind our friends at FDA that it's not really that hard. And we really can do it with numbers. And here's an example of one that we did. First one that I worked on. The people who are involved are scientists of all types, economists, gene jockeys, microbiologists, medical doctors. And we asked the simple question, what's the probability of human health harm from using a particular class of antibiotics called macrolides. You know them as Tylosin, Tilmicin, that kind of thing. On the right, we used the guidelines that came from FDA 152 that Randy showed you, where they show us that there's these steps. And the great thing is, I really appreciate FDA doing this, they say you have to show risk by having a set of, a chain of evidence, if you will, a set of probabilities. And so we did that. First off, you have to give the antibiotic, so we calculate how many animals got the antibiotic. You get some resistant bacteria selected above background because of antibiotic use. That has to get off the farm. You've got to get somebody sick. That person has to go to the doctor. How many of you had diarrhea last year? You don't have to raise your hand. How many of you went to the doctor? No hands. Nobody went to the doctor, right? People don't usually go to the doctor when they get diarrhea. Therefore, they're not going to be able to get treated with the antibiotic that was similar to the one used on the farm. Therefore, the chance of a harm, therefore, the chance of a treatment failure is very low. So we put all these numbers together, and we came to overall, for all antibiotic uses, all macrolide uses, in all livestock, for all purposes, treatment, growth, promotion, and prevention, the risk was about 1 in 10 million. Here's another study from Denmark. They did a very similar thing. And how does 1 in 10 million compare? On the top row, we see this is interfloxacin use in poultry to treat disease. FDA pulled that drug. The risk for that drug was 1 in 30,000. Actually, that's what they calculated. I think that number was way high. What's your risk of being struck by lightning? 1 in 500,000. What's your risk of dying from a bee sting? The average American, not the allergic person. 1 in 6 million. What's the risk of antibiotic macrolide use in food animals causing harm? 1 in 10 million. So I like to say you're more likely to die from a bee sting than you are to have a few extra days of diarrhea because of macrolide use. And then some of these other products, FDA even did one, 100 in 100 million, streptogrammin or virginiamycin. Okay? That's FDA's risk assessment. Pretty darn low. That's the risk-based question. Okay? And I think that's important for people to think about. Because if you're going to make a law, then you hope that law is going to have some benefit, right? Well, I'm telling them it's not going to have much benefit. You'd be better off to outlaw bees. Okay? You'll do more for the public health by outlawing bees. But I did say the risk was there, right? 1 in 10 million. Well, and people have asked me, in all sincerity, just recently, I'm trying to remember where I was. You know, a non-ag crowd, well, why take additional risk? Well, that's a valid question. We're all doing things we shouldn't be doing, right? We're all doing risky behavior, so why add to it? Especially if it's so some farmer can get rich off of it, right? Well, that's a key question, I think, is why add additional risk? The key reason, I think, as a veterinarian, to me this is very important because healthy animals make safe food. When I was in Washington as the Deputy Undersecretary for Food Safety, I was in charge of all meat inspection. My job was exciting because the first week on the job I got to implement the largest meat recall in U.S. history because of those downer cows out in California, if you remember. Why did that happen? Because unhealthy animals were going into the food chain. Okay? 145 million pounds of ground beef had to be recalled. We went to the schools and we bought 20 million pounds of ground beef, USDA. Took it to the dump and poured bleach on it. Okay? Because unhealthy animals entered into the food chain. Does that mean I'm out of time? Gee whiz. Okay, so that's actually a key premise of the original Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Healthy animals make safe food. At least it doesn't seem right to eat unhealthy animals, right? But does it really make safer food? Actually, it does. And Randy Singer and I did a paper in Poultry showing that if you remove antibiotics from poultry, you're going to have more human illness days than if you leave them in. and we counted illness days where the resistant infection, they were sick for 3 days longer than the non-resistant infection. Okay? So then I've been busy trying to answer that question in pigs. Well, theoretically, it makes sense. If animal health goes down, we have more marginally ill animals. Okay? These are, actually, they look great when they come in the pens, or maybe there's a few Taylor Enders in there. They go into the slaughterhouse, and they need some extra attention. They've got to be railed off. They've got to be inspected by the veterinarian. And like Lucy, who was inspecting the chocolates in that skit, she starts to get overwhelmed and starts eating the chocolate. The system can break down if it gets overwhelmed with trim. You have to trim these animals. They need some extra handling, and it's very likely to lead to more contaminated product. More contaminated product is generally assumed to increase human illness. So here's another theoretical way of looking at it. You guys know what it's like in the packing plant. This fellow who's there removing those viscera, his concern is not food safety. His concern is surviving to the next break. Okay? We know these viscera sets are heavy. It's him and 2 other guys with sharp knives going past each other on a moving belt for 8 hours a day. So if he comes along and he runs into a pig like this one in the next picture that has an adhesion, has a little problem being eviscerated, he just pulls a little harder. Okay? Doesn't stop and wash his hands. Doesn't call anybody. He knows later on it's going to get cleaned up or trimmed out. He just keeps moving. We know that about 40% of these pig carcasses in the U.S. have salmonella on board. That means there's a 40% chance that he just contaminated that carcass. And the next carcass, and studies from Europe show that the next 4 carcasses will be contaminated when you have any one animal that's positive. So here again, theoretical idea that healthy animals make safer food. Well, this little guy says that's still not enough. Show me the data. My current position is the following, that the public health risk of unhealthy animals in the food chain is greater than the current antibiotic resistance concern. So we've showed that in poultry, compared the two. We're gathering data for the same thing in pigs. Here's a study that was published, not in some obscure ag journal, but in Public Health Reports, showing that point for pigs. And what we found in this chart on the bottom, we're talking about peel-outs. Peel-out is when we have some extra adhesions. These pigs look fine. They come in. They pass antemortem inspection. They have some extra adhesions that requires them to remove the peritoneal lining. That's called a peel-out. Well, we found that as those peel-out percentages went up, so did carcass contamination in those groups of pigs. So for every 1% increase in peel-outs, there's a 5% increase in contamination of that carcass with Enterococcus, which comes from the GI tract, and with Campylobacter, which makes people sick. So then we did another study. This one is just accepted in the American Journal of Veterinary Research, where we looked at specific carcasses, and we took a picture of each carcass. We looked at 350 some of them, and we found that the carcass on the left, this is one that needs a peel out. It's been eviscerated. Lots of goodies are left in there. It's going to get peeled out. Compared to the one on the left, that one on the left is 90% more likely to be contaminated with salmonella. So the next part of the equation is to calculate that out to public health risk overall. But it seems the data are certainly supporting that premise that healthy animals make safer food. So I thought, based on the bill of sale in the program, that I'd give you a little bit of thoughts on the future of this discussion. You're getting pressure from consumer groups, from CDC and the public health community. Randy mentioned legislation. The Government Accounting Office is currently doing another report on the issue of antibiotic resistance. They were just out at Iowa State in December, November, looking at whether it's causing a problem, how much it's being used. So there's a lot of pressure, and it's not going away. Where I think is going to happen, based on Guidance 209, and I'll share a little more about that in a minute, you're probably going to see calls for, you already are, more veterinary oversight. and some way that they may want to implement more veterinary oversight. I think that's coming. Growth promoters, it's very possible that current labels of growth promoters in the U.S. is going to go away. FDA is hoping that the companies will just remove the labels. Some companies have already. Some companies have it on their label still, but they won't talk about it. You know, you don't hear them talk about use my product for growth promotion or feed efficiency. I'm convinced that better records will be required. And I think this is really important. I testified to the Senate, California Senate Ag Committee, and they started the line of questioning, do you know how much antibiotics are used in livestock? And that was before the most recent report from FDA, and we couldn't say yes emphatically. If we could have said yes emphatically, I know exactly how much, the hearing would have been over. Because bottom line, how can you say you have control over something but if you don't have the data to prove it? If you on your farm or in your system can't tell exactly how much product is used, where, when, and why, then when FDA comes calling, it's going to be harder to convince them. So I think more records, better records are going to help you a great deal. I don't think there's going to be federal legislation anytime soon. Not only has obviously change in the Congress, but FDA is working hard to prevent that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Nuisance cases. Here's an interesting thing. With antibiotic resistance as part of the harm, some of the neighbors are now complaining that you've given me antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And I would say, so? You look fine. Have you had any actual adverse treatment or illnesses because of it? So there's a long chain of evidence we have to look at it. Continued demand for food. The future is also going to tell us that people need to eat. And as income goes up, meat consumption goes up. And they can tell us, I was at a National Academy meeting recently, they can tell us that we ought to all go vegan, but for some reason, people want to eat meat. Therefore, as we get more people, soon be 7 billion people, they're going to want more meat, and it's your job to feed them. At the same time, you're getting pressured about sustainability. You know, can we sustain this current method of production? The short answer is, if it's efficient, if it works, then it is sustainable. Just mentioned Guidance 209 briefly. It was just released. It's no regulatory authority, but the interesting thing is FDA is focusing on medically important antimicrobials. In other words, stuff used on the farm that looks like stuff used in people. And they really want it to be necessary for animal health, and they really want it to have veterinary oversight. So that's why I say I think the future is going to have more veterinary oversight in it for you. And I just have a few quotes out of here. As I said, what they don't like is production or growth promoting, growth enhancing purposes. The great thing is, I will get to that in a second. So they're really focusing on that. Unlike Denmark, Denmark went after growth promotion and prevention. Our country, our guys in FDA are currently just focusing on the growth promotion. They're not going after the prevention uses, which I think is a good point. And this is what this statement is also from there. They said use the targeted groups of animals to prevent, control, or treat disease. So that is a good thing compared to what the legislation was saying. And this is a great thing about our country and the way the government's organized, because the legislative and the executive branch are always in competition. FDA, as the executive branch, wants to solve this problem before legislation is required, because they also understand that legislation is a broad weapon. Regulations can be much more targeted. So FDA is moving forward with this guidance, which is certainly better than what the PAMTA bill would give us. So I think I've said that already. Definitions of oversight. This comes from the FDA document. Evidence of effectiveness. Evidence. Okay, records. Evidence that such a preventive use is consistent with accepted veterinary practice. Evidence that the use is linked to a specific etiological agent. So this is how they're going to deal with the growth promotion issue. If you have a label on a product and it doesn't say for the prevention of X, then it's probably going to, they want that to go away. So they want it to be for a particular bug. Evidence that the use is appropriately targeted, and evidence that there's no reasonable alternatives for the intervention. That relates to, I know the question you folks are always working on, are there other ways to raise healthy pigs without antibiotics? And you're going to need to be able to demonstrate that to FDA, that you've done everything else you can. So what should you do as a producer? Fight the good fight. I think using antibiotics prudently is part of your ethical responsibility. Because I think delivering livestock, healthy livestock, to the consumer is your first concern. And antibiotics is part of that. So you got to fight the good fight. You got to do everything you can before using antibiotics, but when you do use them carefully, fully, prudently. Follow the We Care guidelines from the Pork Board. Pork Board has done a wonderful job for you in helping deal with these issues at a political level, at a specific on-farm level. Keep perfect records. Why? Because, as I said, there's a minimal risk from public health risk from antibiotic use, because healthy animals make safe food, because the world will need increasing amounts of pork production, because antimicrobials help, and because the government and consumers do not always know what's best for them. So because of that, it's your ethical responsibility to do what I just said. Fight the good fight. Continue to keep your antibiotic use house in perfect order, because there's a lot of issues out there. This is only one of them.